Amen.
Amen. Well, I'm really pleased to be here tonight on the full moon, no less.
Yeah, new moon, yeah.
Oh, new moon. Yeah, I'm sorry. You have to correct me. Just a little bit of my background. I was trained as an anthropologist. I have a degree in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and while I was there, I did my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation on two Latter-day Saint subjects. So I started early. So I tell my anthropologist colleagues that I study my own tribe. Yeah. And I've worked for the church for now close to 42 years, and developing museum exhibits and historic sites. And so over the years, I've restored or led the restoration efforts for most of the church's historic site restorations that have gone on. The most recent of which was the priesthood restoration site that was dedicated in 2015 by President Nelson. His first act, I'm getting ahead of myself, but his first act as President of the Quorum of the 12, his first official act. And so I'd like to share tonight a little bit of perspective on why the church restores historic sites, and then talk about the wonderful things that occurred at the priesthood restoration site, and then how we recreated the setting where those wonderful things occurred. Is that fair enough? And I would invite you to ask any questions that might come up, and I might actually seed a few questions for you. Okay. and we'll just we'll just go until everybody gets tired. Okay. So the first question I'd like to address is why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints restores historic sites at all. Very few Christian religions have a historic sites program. The Catholic Church has a lot of historic sites up and down the West Coast of all the missions that were founded in colonial times.
A lot in Europe as well.
A lot in Europe, yeah, and the cathedrals and everything. But not too many, besides Catholicism, not too many Christian religions have a historic sites program, and certainly not any the size of the LDS Church and the size of the church history program, historic sites program. It's kind of way out of scale from the size of the church. And so I'd like to identify three purposes for why I think the church needs to have a historic. It's not just, it's not a good thing. I think it's an essential part of the restoration of the gospel. First of all, the interesting thing is that temples and historic sites are the only church-owned properties that are dedicated by apostolic authority and then never moved or never abandoned. The question then becomes why those two types of properties are so special. And I think that it's because historic sites and temples serve as bookends of the restoration. That is, that period of time that we're in right now. Historic sites are the places where the promises of the restoration were initially revealed by God to man, and the temples are where those promises get fulfilled in the ordinances and covenants of the temple. So that means that historic sites are complementary to temples in the significant role that they play in helping to preserve the legacy of the restoration. And that's kind of a big deal. Another point is historic sites help us renew our covenants. And let me just say it this way. Every Sunday when you go to church, you partake of the sacrament. And the sacrament prayers contain two verbs that constitute the promises that we make to renew our covenant of baptism. And those two verbs are witness and remember. Okay? And so individually, we have an obligation. We make a promise that we will witness to certain things and remember certain other things that are part of the gospel of Jesus Christ and part of the promise that we have for eternity. But I'm going to say this way. Historic sites are a way that the church as a corporation, okay, as a covenant community, makes those same promises of witnessing and remembering of what the Lord has done for us in the latter days. So historic sites are not just a nice place to go on vacation. They're not just kind of interesting physical settings, but they're absolutely, I'm going to call it, like special building blocks of the restoration. I'll just say it that way. And then a third purpose is that they are witnesses not only to God. See, when in the sacrament prayer, who do we witness to? To God. We witness unto thee, O God, the eternal Father. That's how the sacrament prayer goes. So the first thing we witness to is God, that we are faithful to the covenants that we made with him. But we also have another witness to the world, because all of humanity are spiritual children of God, and they need to hear the gospel as well. So historic sites are vehicles of bearing witness to the world that the gospel is here on the earth.
City set on a hill.
A city set, it is a city set on the hill. And these are emblems, these are lights of the city, if you will. And maybe on another occasion I can come and talk about the city of Zion, because that was my dissertation was on the Latter-day Saints city of Zion. So how does the priesthood restoration site fit into this kind of global and quite remarkable purpose? How does it complement the mission of the church? And so when we begin to restore a historic site, the first thing we do is try to define in very clear and profound ways, what does this site have to do with the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ in this dispensation? Okay? It's not because we restore historic sites, not because they're beautiful places or they're in strategic locations or any of that kind of stuff. We restore them because they bear witness of the restoration of the gospel in the latter days. So what is it about the priesthood restoration site that bears witness of the gospel, of the restoration of the gospel? First of all, it is the place where Joseph Smith began three of the key roles that he would play in this dispensation. And the Section 21 of the Doctrine and Covenants begins with a statement that we take in the Church History Department as our divine mandate. It says, "Behold, there shall be a record kept among you." And then that sentence goes on and says, "And in it, thou," meaning Joseph Smith, "shall be called a seer, a translator, a prophet, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, and an elder of the church." Three of those five parts of his divine mission began in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He became a seer where? In the Sacred Grove, when he saw the Father and the Son. He became a translator when he started translating by means of the gift and power of God, the Book of Mormon plates, and he did that in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He became a prophet when he started receiving revelations from God and sharing and speaking in the name of God to those people who were believing him. And he became an apostle at the hands of Peter, James, and John. Not far, not at Harmony, Pennsylvania, but not far away. We don't know exactly where that special visitation occurred, but it was not far away. And so that really crucial, one could say he actually began his ministry in Harmony, Pennsylvania. If I'm going to say it this way, you're probably recording this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Sometimes we call the area around Palmyra, New York, the cradle of the Restoration, you know, because like that's where the church and everything was born. Well, if that's the cradle of the Restoration, but in using this metaphor, then Harmony was the nursery of the Restoration, because that's where Joseph started walking as a prophet and talking as a prophet and acting as a prophet. So that's point number one. Point number two is that in and around Harmony, Pennsylvania is where more Holy Writ, that is more scripture, came forth than any other place on the planet that we know of. 80% of the Book of Mormon was translated there. So roughly that's about 400 pages, right? And the first 15 revelations, chronologically speaking, that he received from God were issued there. So let's say 450 pages of scripture are associated with that period of time in Harmony, Pennsylvania.
And so was that where he worked on the translation too.
He started there when they got the Bible. Where did he buy the Bible? From Mr. Grandin.
Yeah.
Yeah, from Mr. Grandin in the Grandin print in the Palmyra bookstore. So this is kind of a big deal. We don't know of another place on the planet where 450 pages of scripture came forward. That's a big deal. And thirdly, it's where the keys of the priesthood began to be restored in this dispensation. And we talk about the restoration of the priesthood as a process, not as an event or even a series of events. It began in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and it continues today. And we anticipate that there'll be more keys of the priesthood revealed as the millennium approaches. You remember some of you weren't alive at this time, but I remember.
I probably do.
Yeah, when President Kimball talked about the keys of resurrection, and that we don't have them yet. Yeah, that's what he said. We don't have them yet.
That we will have.
Yeah, we have to have them in order to actually perform that priesthood ordinance. Yeah, that's right. So anyway, those are the three kind of big ideas that that we focused the restoration work that we did on the banks of the Susquehanna River. Okay, so now I'm going to just give you a thumbnail overview of the restoration that was done there, and show you like why you should plan a trip there. Okay. So first of all, we reconstructed historic homes. And there were two historic homes that we restored, neither of which existed at the time that we began this restoration work. Both of the homes had been destroyed by fire or just dilapidated over the years. And
Total reconstruction.
a total reconstruction, right? We on the Hale home, this is what we believe the Hale home looks like, Emma's parents.
So this is where Joseph
Yeah. When he was
boarding,
digging for
silver,
treasure, yeah. So he was boarding not in their home, but they had another home on site, a log home whose location we don't know, so we didn't try to restore it. But that's where they met, and yeah, it was where the Hales lived when they first moved into that property, and then they built this. That was their starter home, and then this was their second home.
And we started off the blog and then went to Frank.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very typical.
And there were foundations at this site that we had to kind of figure out what's this foundation and that foundation as opposed to these other foundations, because there were probably 3 sets of homes that have been built on this site since the Hales occupied it. So it was really quite a struggle to figure out how to reconstruct this home, but we think we got it right. At least I don't think anybody's going to prove us wrong.
No, we believe you.
Oops. So this is a big deal. This is also the home where Emma's first child was born and then died just hours later. So it was a boy, but not named. So some people call him Alvin, but he was never named.
So there wasn't a child named Alvin? Was Alvin a different baby then?
The Smiths never had a child named Alvin.
Oh, misconception. You're correcting me here. But the one that people call Alvin would have been there first. Maybe
Yeah,
the
so
one that
there are 2 people called Alvin. One was Joseph's older brother, and then the other is Emma's first child that wasn't called Alvin, but some people call him Alvin.
Where did the name Alvin come from? You don't know where.
I think it's just a tribute.
It just gets associated. And
Huh. Interesting.
so one of the things, I'm just going to take a little teeny bit of detour. So you know about the signs of the times. One of those signs of the times is that there are going to be rumors and wars of rumors. And one of those rumors is Alvin's, the baby's name. Okay. So
Isn't there a gravesite with that baby?
it is right next to this, right on this site. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I misspoke. This is not the home where Emma had her first baby. This is the home where Joseph started. Here's the home where Emma had her first baby. This was like a starter home down the road a ways that Joseph was buying from Mr. Hale, Isaac Hale, who had been selling this home to his older son. Isaac was selling it to Isaac's older son. But then Isaac moved out shortly before Joseph and Emma moved onto the site to be closer to his business, which was a sawmill. He was a sawyer. And this is the bedroom where Emma had her first child. And she just about died from childbirth at the time. You remember that she was really deathly ill. And that was during that same time that Joseph discovered the 116 pages were lost. So
It's like exactly the same thing.
it was, well, so
Like
Emma would,
labor, like
yeah, the baby was born, it died, Joseph buried the baby, and then Joseph was nurturing her back to health, and she said, Joseph, go see what's happening to the 116 pages. And I mean, that was like the first biggest crisis in their life. But this other fairly nondescript setting Emma's kitchen is like my favorite room on the planet, because it was in that very ordinary place where Joseph translated most of the Book of Mormon.
Wait, that's a picture or painting?
It's a picture.
Of what you see now.
If you went back there, then you could see that.
Hard to believe it's that neat.
Well, I'm sure they keep it clean.
We're Latter-day Saints. Cleanliness is,
Do we know Joseph and Emma's first child's name?
no, it didn't have a name.
You missed that part.
It didn't have a name. In fact, the headstone says, baby child of Joseph and Emma Smith, born and died, whatever the date was, I can't remember.
There was some controversy, wasn't there, about whether it was a live birth or a stillborn. And the way I understood it is because of the definition of what a stillborn was at that particular time. And what we consider a stillborn and what they consider a stillborn is two different.
Yeah, so there's an interesting slogan that I like to share with people, and it goes, the past is a foreign country. They speak a different language there. And so you have to, if you're really understanding historical sources, then you have to know the language that they're speaking. And I'm going to introduce a term to you that you probably never heard of before, but it's a common 19th century term that helps us understand where John the Baptist appeared. So speaking of that, we also wanted to upgrade sacred settings, and almost as important as what happened in that very nondescript room that serves as Emma's kitchen is what happened outside in the landscape. And we're in the process of restoring the sugar bush. That's the term I'm going to use. Have you ever heard that term?
No.
Sugar bush?
No.
It's a sugar maple grove.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. It's the sugar bush where John the Baptist appeared, and you thought he appeared down on the river, didn't you? Well, I'm going to plant a seed. When it comes time for questions, one of you asked me, how do we know where John the Baptist appeared? Because we know it wasn't down by the river.
Why would it?
Because
It's a landmark, but I'm just saying, there's no reason for him to be by the river when he appeared.
no, although he,
Well, they did baptism, right?
yeah, so
they did baptisms, but there's no reason for John the Baptist to be by the river.
yeah, so that's one of these other associations that gets made.
There's probably-
And for a century, Latter-day Saint artists would paint
Right.
this event right next to the river.
The stories.
We have better evidence than that.
What?
Very interesting.
And this next scene, you know what happened right there in that water right there?
What?
Somebody got baptized. You know who it was? Joseph Smith.
Say it.
Joseph Smith was baptized in that river, and who else? One of his,
All over there.
Oliver Cowdery was baptized as well. That's kind of a hard name to say, so it's kind of interesting. One baptized the one and the other baptized the other. So in addition to that, we wanted to provide worshipful spaces. In other words, we wanted to create a welcome environment where people could come, whether they were members or not, and worship there. So what we did is we created a dual function building. On the one end, the end with the spire is a meeting house for the Susquehanna branch. And on the other end, you see where the other little portico is on the other end? That's the entrance to the visitor center. And most people who come there are Latter-day Saints. There are not too many non-members who visit our historic sites. Nevertheless, we feel like we need to have two places for those two different functions, and both are sacred.
Do you have a question? how many visitors do you get from the community of Christ or?
Not very many.
RLDS?
Not very many at all. No, they they really focus their visiting that way on Nauvoo because of the Joseph properties, Independence because that's where their headquarters is, Lamoni, Iowa because that's where their college, Graceland College is, and then they have a whole series of camps, youth camps, and that's where they really put a lot of. See, we've got camps that, but they, and we have sites. We put more emphasis, I would say, on our sites than on our camps. They put more emphasis on their camps than their sites. Why? Because the fundamental historical premises on which the community of Christ was organized are incorrect. So they can't rely on the history quite as much as we can.
I see.
You see what I mean? And those fundamental premises are that Joseph was not a polygamist and that Joseph ordained his son, Joseph III, to succeed him.
Makes sense.
Okay. We also wanted to create inspiring visitor experiences. So we recreated a whole film of, not that tells the whole story of that, but it's the beginning of the translation of the Book of Mormon and the restoration of the priesthood. And we commissioned these two, I think, spectacular paintings that are probably the most historical paintings that we know of, that exist, of these two sublime events. The coming of John the Baptist, whose date we know and whose location we're pretty sure of, and the coming of Peter, James, and John, whose location we don't know, at least precisely, and whose date we're unsure of. Nevertheless, we're sure of the event, so we've depicted the event. And we've depicted as much about the setting as we know from quite extensive historical research.
What a fun job you have.
Well, that's why I'm still going at 70.
I was going to say, I noticed that in the painting you just showed us, John has his hands on
Oh,
only
wow.
head.
Very observant. You get an A.
Where did you say the Harvard Fairbanks? I
The Avard
think.
Fairbanks.
Sorry,
So that's, okay, so explain that again, because I
Well, I
got,
just noticed in my mind when I think of artistic representations, it's John the Baptist with his hands on both
like this.
like this, and maybe that has to do with the accounts,
Mhm,
because he says, "Upon you, my fellow servants," plural.
mhm.
Right. So I don't know. So yeah. So tell us. You're probably going to tell us about it.
So which one is it? Which one's the accurate one?
I'm sure yours.
Yeah. Tell us. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yours, of course.
No, we don't know.
Oh,
We don't know.
Oh.
So-
you're
So what we've done, because we don't want to perpetuate something that may be untrue,
You just have both.
we have both.
Okay.
And so in the statues,
Yeah.
we have two statues that represent the simultaneous ordination, and then, oops, and then we have this painting, and then in the film, we depict sequential ordination. And we genuinely don't know. So, and we don't want, so here's the other thing is, we don't want anybody to get whacked out about that. So we just acknowledge that there's some ambiguity, and somebody will figure that out later
And
on.
you probably all your tour guides are taught.
Yeah, that's right.
It gets stronger.
Now, is in the film, is it Joseph first as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he's the first elder. But
Well, is he
yeah,
the
that's-
first deacon
Yeah, that's right.
or priest or whatever?
See, he wasn't ordained to an office.
Right. He's only
He
given
just-
the priesthood.
He was given the priesthood.
You're right.
Because the offices pertain to the church that wasn't organized yet,
Correct. Yeah.
but the priesthood does not.
Yeah, interesting.
Just like at the hands of Peter, James, and John, he received the keys of the apostleship, but he didn't become an elder until the day the church was organized. So this is kind of interesting. This is a little trivia thing for you. Joseph became an apostle before he was an elder.
Or to see Christ.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so elder, that's the point, is elder has two connotations. One is it's an office in the church. The other is that it's a spiritual calling. And he was formally ordained. He was given the keys of the apostleship on the banks of the Susquehanna River near Harmony, Pennsylvania. And then he became an elder, the first elder of the church under the hands of Oliver Cowdery on April 6th, 1830, upwards of a year later.
Now, are you going to mention anything about, I believe it was Father Whitmer's
Cap,
where his,
they heard the voice of the Lord.
yeah, but wasn't there, I mean, by some, correct me if I'm wrong, by some accounts, that's where the first Melchizedek priest ordinations occurred. Am I remembering that right? Or is it more?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a controversy among
Yeah.
historians about the date of the ordination of Peter, James, and John. And some claim that it was just weeks, just very briefly after the coming of John the Baptist. So John the Baptist came May 15th, 1829, and most people, including the church, believes that that Peter, James, and John came by the end of June of 1829. There are some people who claim, including Richard Bushman, that Peter, James, and John came after the church was organized, because there's some discrepancy about the dates.
Like June 27th or something like that.
Yeah, something. So anyway, we don't get too whacked out about that, just because
Interesting.
it's a factoid that doesn't make that any bit of difference. In fact, there's so many historical uncertainties about not only the church being organized, but the original church being organized. At the, when was Christ born? What year? We don't know. There's just who is Saint John? What was Saint John's first name? I'm just kidding. No,
Like
but
George Washington.
yeah.
Right?
So
Yeah.
there are just a lot of people that get all whacked out about the fact that we don't know everything, and I think it's really quite remarkable that we know as much as we know. Okay, because Joseph wasn't told to keep a record until April 6th, 1830. So it's almost by accident that he knows any like historical factoids before that time.
Well, even in the scriptures, it's not defined.
Mhm.
It's about this, or it's not specific. And I don't think it's really important that we have to have stuff specific.
It's really important to some people, but I don't think it is. Yeah.
Pretty busy.
So-
I mean, he was pretty busy. If you think of all the things he did, like,
Joseph. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
So why do you
Yeah.
think he remembered May 15th, 1829? That was a very specific date, and it was a relatively, I won't say minor occurrence, but it wasn't as significant as the coming of Peter, James, and John.
I don't know if the first angel shows up, it might be important.
So here's what my colleague Mark Staker believes, and that is, and he's done most of the research on this site. He was our historical contact person. But what he acknowledges, this is a fact, is that May 15th was one of Emma's cousin's birthdays. And he believes that Emma was gone that day to celebrate her cousin's birthday. And Joseph made that association and remembered the dates accordingly.
It helps when you have something significant
Yeah.
to remember at heart.
That's right. Okay, so these two sets of sculptures, a bas-relief and a full figure of both the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood, were done by Avard Fairbanks. And this one, they were both done in the 1960s. This one was done first, and those were done second afterwards. And the originals were on Temple Square, right? Remember being down there on Temple Square? So the interesting thing, to come back to your point, is here we have the simultaneous ordination depicted in the Avard Fairbanks sculpture. And the church has recently adopted a policy. This is not a doctrine, it's not a principle, it's a policy that no depiction like this will be accepted by the church unless approved by the First Presidency. Because they didn't want to imagine, they didn't want to create kind of a theological dilemma. You know what I mean? How it really happened. So they said, we're going to adopt the general practice of one ordination per person, one person per ordination, unless the First Presidency says otherwise. So that policy was in place before we were raising the question about whether or not we could make replicas of those sculptures. So we went to the First Presidency with a little bit of fear and trepidation, but these are by far, these are not only the best artistic representations of these sublime events ever given, but they're probably, I'm going to say it this way, they're probably the best sculptures ever done by a Latter-day Saint artist.
On any subject.
Just extraordinary, just extraordinary. Avard Fairbanks was a genius.
Now, how big are they?
These are both, these are life size.
They're heroic size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're just slightly larger.
The person would be standing about here.
Because they weren't around when they were in the Temple Square. You didn't see it.
Oh, I remember them there.
You do, okay.
Now, but I only remember this 2015. I mean, I know that one wasn't there. I only remember the full one. I don't remember was the bas relief. Was that on Temple Square?
No.
Remember the two
Okay.
on the right.
Only the two on the right.
Not on the
Okay.
left.
Yeah, that's what I remember.
I don't remember this,
Now, off any sort of official record.
Off the record, except
Yeah,
for
well, I
we're
mean, like,
recording.
I'm explicitly asking your opinion,
Okay.
whether you think it was simultaneous
I officially don't know.
or. Right.
You see, and I don't.
can see it either way, right?
I don't have an opinion. I can recognize, so the official language that we use, the scriptural language of the account is, Joseph said, that the angel said, upon you, my fellow servants, in the name of Messiah, I confirm the priesthood of Aaron, blah, blah, blah.
So that makes it sound simultaneous.
So that does sound simultaneous, but I know from my anthropological background that sometimes dialogue is
Summarized.
is given kind of a high, it's taken to a higher, almost a ritual significance as opposed to a documentary significance. And Joseph may have been narrating this in this kind of ritual, in ritual terms, not in documentary terms.
And another thing is when you are recalling an event that happened to you, details don't always come through,
Mm-hmm.
and you generalize. And it changes as you retell the story from one point to another point. It's not consistent because just the nature of the way we talk and we tell stories, it's not consistent.
So I'm going to tell you something about the sculptures that you don't know that I do know.
Okay.
Okay. And that is when we got approval to make the replicas, I wanted to have a good friend of mine make the replicas, because he was just an extraordinary sculptor in his own right. and B, he loved the priest. He loved the Aaronic priesthood. He was just a boy's man, and he just loved the Aaronic priesthood. And so I went and talked with him, and then and he accepted the commission. And later on, I found out that at the beginning of his life, the beginning of his career, his adult life, he was Avard Fairbank's last student.
Oh,
He worked with Avard for 3 years before Avard became too old to sculpt anymore. And so he was more familiar with Avard's technique and style, and even his vision of what a sculpture should be like. And so he just poured his heart and soul into the replica, the making of these replicas, and they are just stunning. His name was Peter Fillerup.
So these were new sculptures, is that what?
They were new replicas.
Yes, but they were replicas by sculpting, not by
No.
making a mold.
No, he made the casting,
Oh, he did make-
but they had to. I mean, it's much more complicated than you.
I used to make molds.
Okay.
Bronze.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
So
it's
you know a
not-
little bit about it. So
Yeah.
we made arrangements to go down to Temple Square. They put the release agent on it, put the rubber latex around it, and took it around and took it off and everything. And I was checking up on him one time at his studio up in Heber, and I said, he made the John the Baptist one first because it's less complicated. I said, could I see the John the Baptist? He says, it's right over there. There was just a pile of parts, just like 200 pieces of bronze that he now had to put back together in this kind of elegant way. And then they have to grind off the edges. And, it really is. So it takes quite an artistic ability
yeah.
and a lot of strength and a lot of perseverance to get it done right.
Where are the originals now?
Well, they're in storage, and they'll probably be put back on Temple Square.
Okay. Just curious.
We also had to create a landscape that was safe and secure and accessible. So we relocated the road, negotiated with the railroad company, a safe crossing of the railroad, created access to the river, because all this property, when we started working on this property, this project a number of years ago, it was all privately owned. We had just this teeny bit of landlocked property down right about there. And so this is a little bit of an irony, but people, Latter-day Saints who would take their kids down to the Susquehanna River to have them baptized were actually committing a sin to get down to the river. They were trespassing. And then they were committing one more sin to get out of the river up to their car. So
Transgress.
that's good.
I know
So
there's a lot of-
we own all that property now, but
Yeah. I know that they did a lot of research about the time frame that the actual baptism occurred in, that the water levels were up higher than it is now.
oh, you're getting to the question that I was trying to seed before, and that
Oh.
is, how do we know that it wasn't in the river?
Yeah,
How do we know, or by the river?
yeah.
And one of the things we know is that on May 15th, 1829, the river was about 10 feet above flood stage.
Wow.
So if it was on the banks of the river were a long ways away from the current banks of the river, which would have been way over there. And there was a story, there was a very strong story and a belief by many people in the area somehow President Kimball, when he was on site, he was talking to a group of people and he said, I believe that it was right over there that John the Baptist stood. And so the story goes, one of the men in the audience ran home, got a stake, and pounded into the ground just on that point where President Kimball said that's where John the Baptist appeared. So we were trying to track all this stuff down because we didn't want to be contradicting. We didn't want to have wars with rumors anymore. So what we did is we talked the man who was associated with the story was dead, but his son was still alive. And so we called him up and said, did your dad ever tell you this story? And he said, no. And he wouldn't have said that. And we said, why not? And he says, because the Susquehanna River floods every year, and that place, this presumed place, it would have been way underwater at the time. So John the Baptist couldn't have appeared at the place where President Kimball said, oh, I think it was over there. And then we asked President Kimball's son, Eddie Kimball, who was with his father for the last like 10 years of his life and writing all the biographies and everything on President Kimball. And we said, we're trying to track down this story about your dad. Did you ever hear anything about that? And he says, no. In all the times I've been working with him, he never said that. And he was a voluminous journal keeper. He just kept, I saw the series of journals. It was a journal about that thick every year for his apostolic ministry. And so if he had had that kind of impression, he would have written in his journal. But Eddie Kimball said, you know, I never heard him say anything like this, but if it happened, it would be in his journal. And I'll go back and just search his journals again and just to see. And he called us back, 2 weeks later, and he says, I looked through every possible record that he left behind, and there's no evidence to suggest that he was on the site and said that. He was on the site, but he never said, there's no evidence that he would have said that. So that's one piece of evidence, that the claim is unfounded. We can't claim by historical evidence that John the Baptist did, but we can't prove that he didn't, except we can. Okay, we got the proof. So May 15th, 1829, how far above flood stage was the river? 10 feet, yeah, 10 feet above flood stage. And that was the perfect opportunity for artisans and craftsmen and farmers upstream to get their goods to market. They'd been working all winter to kind of make this work. And all of a sudden in the spring runoff, it was just like the perfect time to hire some boatmen to take all those goods to market downstream, down to Harrisburg and even down into Maryland. So the question then becomes, yeah, but what about May 15th, 1829? Because see, the interesting thing is that when you try to figure out what really happened, what's the first thing you do? You talk to the first-hand witnesses, right? Mm-hmm. And who were the witnesses to the coming of John the Baptist? Joseph and Oliver, right? Duh. So you go to everything they said about it. So you track down everything they said during their whole life about the coming of and they said things like, we went into the woods to pray. We went into the sugar bush. We went aside the abodes of men. In other words, we went to a private place where there wasn't anybody else. So could that have been down by the river? Well, this guy Mark Staker that I told you about earlier, in his snooping around this whole area of Northeast Pennsylvania, he discovered a boat log, because there would be places along the river where the boatmen would have to pay a toll for people who took care of the river. Well, this boat log actually had a record for May 15th, 1829. Can you believe that? And on that day, he counted the number of boats in this log, and there were 100 boats that went by the Joseph Smith property on that day. So it would have been never, no end to boat traffic, no privacy at all on that time.
I wonder if anybody ever saw that event, you know, people who were going by.
It happened elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the conclusion, is that if you take what Joseph and Oliver said about it, you know, we went into the woods to pray, we went into the sugar bush, and sugar maples don't grow in the wet and sandy soil of a riverbank. They just don't.
Yeah, but the baptism.
Yeah, so, yeah, it had to be in the water, but we don't know that it happened like what John the Baptist said is, or what Joseph said, John said is, he instructed us to go baptize you. And so he said, we repaired to the river. Well, that means it could be a while, away.
When they found us.
And it didn't have to be that very moment.
No, I didn't think that.
So there's some people that think, in fact, my friend Mark Saker believes that they baptize each other later in the evening.
That's what I was just thinking.
At the end of the day,
Where it wasn't quite as obvious.
when all the boats were
Yeah.
moored up for the evening. So when you actually find out what the records actually say, it's a lot more believable than what sometimes we create, the images we create. So let me just finish by talking about the dedication. This is one of the most special events in my life. President Nelson came on September 19th, 2015, and dedicated this site. And when he was given the assignment to go there, he was third in the Quorum of the 12 in seniority. There were 2 apostles ahead of him, but then there were 2 deaths in the Quorum of the 12 in those next 6 months. And so when he went on site, he was president of the Quorum of the 12. And
Yes, God didn't choose.
and he said, so after that event, when he went back to Salt Lake City, the word I got, I didn't know this firsthand, but secondhand, I was told by many people that he just couldn't stop talking about such a sublime location and such a wonderful place, and how the Spirit was very strong there and would serve the purposes of a historic site. And he even put that in that little memoir that what's her name? Sherry Dew wrote of him. He said it was the most, what he said is, the dedicating this site was the most significant use of his priesthood in his entire life up to that point. Now that is saying something, because he's not prone to or extravagance, hyperbole. So there he is, dedicating the site and on tour with his wife and then Elder and Sister Snow. Oh yeah. You see that guy with the bald head? There you are. Go. I was right on the front row.
I was actually looking for you as well. So I'm glad she asked that.
Turn around, let's see the back of your head.
Yeah. Oh, there it is.
There it is.
That's it. I recognize you now. Now, was the
And the enzyme and stuff, the photos.
These were some that were taken on site. I don't think these were from, I didn't get them from the ensign. I got them from the photographer.
The dedication include both the sugar bush and also
Mhm.
also down to the perhaps it's that whole, I guess it's the whole thing you showed in the last row, the map there.
That, yeah, all that green area is what the
Okay.
church owns.
So,
And this is the cemetery where Alvin is buried. And Emma's parents are buried there as well.
We actually had one.
They did, right? Isaac and Elizabeth. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. This is really quite an extraordinary experience. Let me just end by way of testimony, and I'll give you my testimony of the site by sharing an experience that Sister Nelson and I had after the dedication. So after the dedication, we walked him out of the meeting house into the visitor center, where he was going to be interviewed by all these press people. So Sister Nelson and I kind of trundled off to the side, just kind of watching him and talking. And during our conversation, she got up like right that close to me, and she says, "Now, Brother Olsen, what do you know about this site now, today, and you didn't know yesterday?" I thought, wow, that's a pretty good question. And what I said is that he said, "Sister Nelson, I know that Heavenly Father has accepted of our offering. Imperfect as it is, He now can magnify our limited capacity to fulfill His purposes for directing the prophet to restore and vindicate this site." And that's my testimony to you today. Is that all of that stuff that I talked about at the beginning is, again, historic sites are not just special places to go on vacation or kind of neat things to have a neat conference at or that sort of thing. They're the building blocks of the restoration of the gospel in this dispensation. And they will serve that purpose in the moment.
thank you.
I have a
Any-
question.
Okay, I was gonna ask if there's any questions.
Can you go back to the picture of Nelson?
The which one?
President Nelson.
Oh.
President Nelson.
Mhm.
What are those window-looking things on stands?
Oh, those are teleprompters. So rather than reading his talk, what happens is that they put the talks on a special machine, and then it projects. You can't see it on this side, but on the other side, you can see it's special glass that projects the talk, the words from the talk, so that he can read the talk, and it looks like he's looking right at you, but he's just reading the talk. And that's what they do in general conference too. Yeah.
Wait, so they're projecting onto the wall?
No,
Onto
just
the
on the
glass.
other side of the glass. So it's interesting that most of the time when you see things project on a window or a glass, you see it on both sides. But this is special kind of glass where you don't see it if you're looking one way, but you do see it if you're looking the other way.
And it allows people to see through the glass to the speaker.
Yeah, yeah. That's a very good question.
Once you know what to look for, you'll see it in the news conference, like not just general conference, but like.
It's
Like
universal.
President
news.
Biden will use teleconference.
Yeah. It's in a lot of different territories.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Sure, fire away.
So we were planning on going into the Wilkmore pageant last year. We had a whole road trip plan. We were gonna go to the
Uh-huh.
Harmony and the Susquehanna site. And so, do you know if they're gonna do it this year? Do you have insider
There was just a
knowledge?
recent announcement that they're not doing it this year, and so there's not ever going to be another Hilcomore pageant.
Oh, they're
You
stopping
missed
it?
So we can go do one ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is going to be a rewrite. Well, the prophet doesn't ask my opinion about things,
Well,
so
we do, we have an opinion.
So,
Finish
so,
what you're gonna say.
well, they're gonna broadcast, they're gonna stream live a recording of the last pageant that was held. Yeah, so you'll be able to see it. Now, my opinion off the record, except for
Yeah, you can stop it if you want.
I believe that on the one hand, pageants are becoming passé. I think another reason is that it was really expensive, both in terms of the investment of human capital and the investment of money to keep the pageants up, and that the missionary department, which had been running the pageants, realized that the return on investments, so far as quality referrals, were not in pageants. You couldn't justify pageants in terms of the quality of referrals, and it was believed that what they did is they did a fairly extensive study and found that the pageants were most meaningful for the performers, not the audience.
Sure.
So when they actually looked at the data, they realized that pageants weren't worth it. That they kept the Nauvoo pageant, at least for the foreseeable future. And there are 2 pageants in Nauvoo shown every year.
I was very lucky to see the Yokohama, and it's a beautiful pageant. And like I said, it was very touching for me. And my sister actually got to participate, but she wasn't in the pageant herself. She was she worked within the audience and dealt with the people.
Mhm.
And she got to do that when she was 18, 21, and that was in the 60s.
Yeah.
I have a fond memory of it. I'm kind of sad.
It's a little bit like, I'm just going to say it this way. You remember, some of us are old enough to remember when the church did away with all of the church hospitals. You remember all the LDS hospitals? And there was a belief that somehow they made a mistake, and how would healthcare in the Great Basin recover from this abandonment? Well, now you look at IHC and how extraordinary, that's the successor to this network of hospitals, and it's one of the finest medical provider companies in the world. So, and that happened as well with all of the church academies. The church used to have a whole series of academies up and down the Wasatch Front, all throughout the Great Basin. And at some point they realized, no, that wasn't worth it. We need to spend our money in more global outreach stuff like seminaries and institutes and online instruction.
Well, they're bringing back the BYU Academy, for high school. They're
Yeah,
pushing that.
but not by the church.
But-
The church isn't doing that.
The church isn't, but
No,
the school is.
That's a private venture.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
I didn't know. Okay.
So this is one of those other things where the church gets to a point where it has to invest, it has to make some hard decisions about investing into the future. And the future of the church is in the global church and not the American church or the Western American church.
And also, well, that's one thing I really appreciated about General Conference, was that we tried to acknowledge the global church.
Yeah, I think that Sunday morning
Yeah.
profile
That was
was
wonderful.
basically a statement about the future
Yeah,
of the church's, the future of the church is going to look like that.
yeah. But
So we need to get used to that.
I do have a question about pageants. I have all the pageants except the Nauvoo ones been closed?
Yes.
Stopped? Okay.
Some they've allowed like a local church entity.
Uh-huh.
So the decision was that the church headquarters will
Was
not
not involved.
not sponsor any of those.
Mhm.
If a local community or something else or a local church unit wants to do it, then they can do it through through the authorization of the area presidency. But I don't think they're just really not sustainable. It just, it's very, very difficult to sustain.
What if a local state wanted to?
If they wanted to, but having them do it year after year after year after year.
But it's
right.
a one-shot thing, maybe.
Yeah, so,
We went to the Nantucket pageant twice the last year. I'm glad we did that. And I wondered what they were gonna do with all those folding chairs. Yeah.
well, you know where they got those folding chairs?
From all the states.
From all the states
So
that
they were
went belly
already
up. Yeah,
hand-me-down.
they were already hand-me-downs.
They were already hand-me-downs, yeah. I kind of got that impression because they're not the best.
So I have a couple more questions.
Far away.
Okay, so, if we wanted to still have a road trip to go to the church historical site, do you know what the status is about visitor centers being open?
They're closed right now.
With no, like,
No, I,
planned date, probably?
No, because it really depends on the progress of the pandemic.
a lot of them are doing,
Take pandemic?
doing things
Whatever.
over the internet, because my sister-in-law's sister is back in Harmony,
Mhm.
and that's what she's doing, it's over the internet. She's on the mission, and she does everything over the internet.
Yeah, so virtual tours are live and well, and
Yeah.
and they're going worldwide. It's amazing how many people are taking virtual tours.
So, we did go to Missouri a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
and, I was surprised that there's no site for Hans Mill. There's no, like, church. You know,
The church that owns
it
Hans
owns the
Mill.
property, and you can trek out there on the dirt roads if you want to, but
We know that there was a mill there. We know there was a well there. We know there was a blacksmith shop there. And we've done extensive studies to try to locate the foundations of those structures.
Yeah.
And we have not found any evidence. And that's not to say they weren't there, but that ground is so wet that it probably destroyed all the evidence that was there.
Because it was wood, mostly.
But that's why the church has never restored anything there, is because we feel like we have to have a very high degree of certainty that this is the way it looked. And we don't want to recreate something just as kind of a stage set.
okay. So, is there ongoing, there is a closed case as far as doing research?
We don't know what else to do,
Okay.
frankly.
So
We
it's
don't.
kind of-
And the other part of this is, I'm going to say it this way, I think in the end, what we really want to do is honor the people who died there, not talk about the persecutions that may be motivated.
Do a monument, in other words.
So I think what we're gonna, if there's any development whatsoever, it will probably be more like a memorial than a historic
I
site.
guess that's kind of what I was expecting when we were making the